April 1945, a shattered town near Würzburg, Germany. The air smells of wet stone, cordite, and diesel exhaust. Dust from collapsed masonry hangs in the morning light like a thick gray fog. Along the main thoroughfare, American soldiers move in a frantic, low-velocity crawl. They hug the base of blackened brick walls. They sprint across open intersections with their heads tucked into their shoulders. Every man in the battalion knows the sound of a high-velocity rifle. They know a German sniper is watching the square from a hidden perch. But one man does not crouch. He walks down the center of the street with his chin up and his chest out. He ignores the frantic warnings of his men. He treats the invisible threat as a personal insult to his rank. It is a display of vanity that is about to cost a better man his life. General Patton is miles away, but he will soon learn what happens when ego outranks experience. This is the story of a battalion commander who valued the appearance of bravery over the lives of his own men and the price paid by those forced to follow him. It is a tale of how a single bullet exposed the difference between a leader and a performer. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when ego outranked experience. First Lieutenant Andrew Kim was 24 years old. He came from Los Angeles, California, where his parents ran a small grocery store in a neighborhood that felt a world away from the ruins of Würzburg. He had served in the infantry for nearly 3 years, earning his commission through grit and a steady hand under fire. Kim was a man of quiet competence. He had a younger sister back home who sent him hand-drawn maps of the garden she was planting for his return. For 8 months, he had served as an aide to a man who viewed the world through the lens of a 19th-century cavalry officer. Kim had already saved his commander's life twice, once in the hedgerows of Normandy and again during the chaos of the Bulge. Both times, he had physically tackled the older man to keep him from being shredded by mortar fragments. He viewed his job not as a duty to rank, but as a commitment to keeping a father and a husband alive. Even when that man seemed determined to find a grave in foreign soil, Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Marsh was 42 years old and hailed from an old, established family in Savannah, Georgia. He carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who believed his bloodline provided a natural immunity to fear. To Marsh, the battlefield was a stage, and he was the lead actor. He often remarked to his staff that an officer who sought cover was an officer who had already lost the respect of his men. He wore a tailored wool coat and kept his leather boots polished to a mirror shine, even in the mud of the German spring. He viewed the modern necessity of foxholes and stone walls as undignified for a field-grade officer. His ideology was simple and lethal. Leadership was a visual performance of invulnerability. He had walked upright through 3 previous engagements, emerging without a scratch, a fact he used to justify his continued defiance of basic infantry tactics. He did not see the terror in the eyes of the men who had to stand near him. He only saw his own reflection in the eyes of history. This arrogance was the invisible weight that Andrew Kim carried every time they stepped into the sunlight. By April 1945, the Third Army was tearing through the heart of Germany, but the war had become a jagged, unpredictable thing. The massive armored sweeps that defined the race across France had been replaced by a grinding, house-to-house struggle in ancient Bavarian towns. Würzburg had been largely reduced to a skeleton of scorched timber and pulverized stone, yet the ruins were more dangerous than the open fields. The German army was collapsing, but its remnants were desperate. Pockets of resistance, often consisting of teenage boys and hardened snipers, remained hidden in the upper stories of shattered apartments. These snipers did not care about the grand strategy of the crumbling Reich. They only cared about taking one more life before the end came. In this chaotic environment, military discipline began to fray in 2 different directions. Most soldiers became hyper-vigilant, developing a sixth sense for the unnatural stillness of a street that was being watched. They moved in shadows. They stayed low. But for a specific class of officer, the proximity of victory brought a strange and deadly hubris. They felt the war was already won, and they wanted to ensure their personal legacy was one of gallantry rather than survival. While the privates and sergeants learned to respect the lethality of a single window, some commanders felt that acknowledging the danger was a form of cowardice. Other senior officers often looked the other way, chalking it up to eccentricity or old-school grit. They let the vanity slide because they were tired, and they were close to home. But in the 11th Armored Division, the cost of that vanity was about to be tallied in blood. The battalion was moving into the town square, unaware that their commander's refusal to duck was about to collide with a sniper's cold patience. Lieutenant Colonel Marsh stepped out of the shadow of a partially collapsed bakery and into the center of the town square. His aide, Lieutenant Kim, moved with him, but Kim's knees were bent, and his eyes were locked on the high windows of the clock tower 300 yards away. The rest of the battalion staff remained pressed against the stone facade of the post office. A captain from the forward company hissed through his teeth, calling out for the colonel to get down, but Marsh didn't even turn his head. Kim reached out and grabbed the sleeve of the colonel's jacket. He told him that they had a confirmed sighting of a sharpshooter in the tower, and that the area was a registered kill zone. Marsh stopped walking and looked at Kim's hand on his arm, as if it were a poisonous insect. He told the lieutenant to remove his hand immediately. Kim let go but stood his ground, explaining that the men were taking their cues from him, and that if he was shot, the entire advance would stall in the square. Marsh adjusted his collar and told him that an officer does not skulk behind walls because it sets a poor example for the infantry. He said that a leader must be a visible beacon of resolve, not a frightened rabbit hiding from shadows. Kim stepped in front of him, physically blocking his path, and begged him to listen to the scouts. He said that bravery wasn't the same as suicide. Marsh's face turned a deep, mottled red. He shoved Kim back with both hands and told him that his caution was beginning to look like cowardice. He shouted for Kim to stand aside, declaring that no German with a rifle was going to dictate how a United States Army officer conducted himself on the field of honor. As Marsh took his next step forward, a sharp, dry crack echoed through the square. The sound didn't come from the ground. It dropped from the sky. Kim, still trying to shield the man who had just pushed him away, was caught in the open. The bullet struck him in the throat, spinning him around before he hit the cobblestones. Marsh stood entirely unscathed, looking down at the red pool spreading beneath his aide's head. The colonel didn't move. He didn't even duck. He just stared. Within 40 minutes, the report of the incident and the colonel's refusal to take cover had bypassed the regimental commander and landed directly on the desk of General Patton. Patton arrived within the hour. The roar of a high-velocity jeep engine cut through the heavy silence of the town square. The vehicle skidded to a halt near the spot where the blood of Lieutenant Kim had already begun to darken the porous stone. Patton stepped out before the wheels had fully stopped turning. He wore his full service uniform, every button catching the pale German sun. His 4 stars glinted on his helmet, and the ivory grips of his revolvers were visible at his hips. He did not look at the clock tower where the sniper had been. He did not look at the grieving soldiers. He looked directly at Lieutenant Colonel Marsh, who stood stiffly by a doorway. The general's gait was measured and heavy. He stopped 3 feet from Marsh, his shadow stretching across the ground toward the stain where Kim had fallen. Patton asked Marsh if the report he received was accurate. Marsh nodded and said it was. Patton then asked if the lieutenant had warned him of the sniper. Marsh replied that he had. Patton asked if the lieutenant had physically tried to move him to safety. Marsh stiffened and said that the boy had become hysterical and forgotten his place. Patton's voice dropped an octave, becoming a cold, vibrating rasp. He asked Marsh why he had pushed the boy away. Marsh adjusted his gloves and said that he would not have his command seen cowering in the dirt. He told Patton that an officer must be a symbol of courage that transcends the fear of death. He said he stood his ground to prove a point about American leadership. Patton leaned in until his face was inches from Marsh's. He told the colonel that he had been shot at more times than Marsh had been to church. He said that in all those years, he had never once mistaken a brick wall for a sign of cowardice. He told Marsh that there is a profound difference between being brave and being a target. He said that a leader's first job is to stay alive so he can lead his men into the next fight, not to provide a target for a bored teenager with a Mauser. He pointed to the empty space on the ground and said that Lieutenant Kim was dead because Marsh wanted to look like a statue in a park. He told Marsh that he had occupied the space where the bullet was meant to go, and because he was too proud to move, a better man had stepped into that space to save a fool. Patton told him that his vanity was not gallantry. It was a dereliction of duty that had cost the United States Army a valuable officer. he gave Marsh a choice. He could hand over his sidearm and face a court-martial for reckless endangerment, or he could take a shovel and personally dig the grave for the man he had murdered with his own arrogance. Patton made it clear that either way, Marsh would never lead men again. He told the colonel that his war was over, and it was ending in the dirt. Marsh did not choose the court-martial, he took the shovel. Under the watchful eyes of the entire battalion, the lieutenant colonel stripped off his polished wool coat and his pristine gloves. He stepped into the soft, churned earth of a field behind the town square where the temporary graves were being prepared. Patton stood 10 paces away, his arms folded across his chest, his ivory revolvers glinting in the afternoon light. Every time Marsh slowed his pace, Patton's voice would cut through the air like a whip, telling him to dig deeper. The soldiers of the battalion watched in a heavy, suffocating silence. They saw their commander, the man who had refused to bend his knees to save a life, now forced to bend his back in the dirt. Marsh's hands, once kept clean by his rank and his vanity, soon blistered and bled against the rough wooden handle of the spade. He could smell the damp, metallic scent of the earth and the lingering smoke of the town. He heard the rhythmic thud of the shovel hitting stone and the labored sound of his own breath. By the time the sun began to dip behind the ruins, the grave was finished. It was a perfectly rectangular hole in the ground, exactly the size of the man who had died trying to protect him. Marsh stood in the pit he had dug, covered in the very soil he had once felt too superior to touch, looking up at the men who no longer feared him, but only felt a cold, distant pity. Andrew Kim was buried in the soil of Würzburg, but his memory was carried back to Los Angeles by the men of his platoon who survived the final weeks of the war. His sister never got to show him the garden she had planted. But she received a personal, handwritten letter from General Patton that she kept framed until her death in 2002. The letter did not mention the vanity of a colonel. It spoke only of a soldier who had died standing tall so that others might live. Kim was posthumously awarded the Silver Star, a medal that his family eventually donated to a local museum as a reminder of the quiet cost of duty. Theodore Marsh was relieved of his command that evening and sent to the rear in a supply truck. Stripped of his rank and his pride, he was eventually allowed to resign from the army in late 1945, avoiding a formal court-martial but losing the career he had built on the myth of his own invulnerability. He returned to Savannah, where he lived out the rest of his life as a bitter, reclusive man who never quite understood why the world had changed around him. He died in 1978, leaving behind a trunk full of polished medals and tailored uniforms that had never seen the inside of a foxhole. General Patton mentioned the incident only once in a private diary entry, dated 3 days after the burial. He wrote that a leader who cannot distinguish between courage and theater is a murderer with a commission. He noted that the most difficult part of command was not defeating the enemy, but protecting the brave from the arrogant. He kept a small piece of stone from the Würzburg square on his desk for the remainder of the campaign, a silent weight that served as a reminder of the space Andrew Kim had died to fill. Some historians argue that Patton was needlessly cruel to an officer who, despite his flaws, had led his battalion through months of brutal combat without faltering. They suggest that the public humiliation of a senior commander served only to damage morale at a time when the army needed every experienced leader it could find. Others argue that Patton's response was a necessary corrective to a toxic culture of vanity that viewed the lives of junior officers as disposable theater. They maintain that by forcing Marsh to dig the grave, Patton sent a message that saved countless lives in the final weeks of the war. What is certain is that after that afternoon in Würzburg, the casualty rates for aides and staff officers in the division dropped significantly, as commanders suddenly found a new appreciation for the safety of stone walls. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply issued a formal reprimand? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when ego outranked experience, make sure to subscribe.